Sir, how long have you been in the Philippines, and how are you finding it so far?
So I've been here about 6 months now, and I've really, really enjoyed it. I've had a marvellous time. We've had a tremendously warm welcome here in the Philippines. But of course, this is not the first time that I visited the Philippines. I first came here some 38 years ago. 38 years ago.
Were we born then already? Yeah.
So yeah, I was a university student, and my parents were kind of intrepid travellers who came up into Southeast Asia, and they decided that we should travel throughout the region, and first came here.
Yes, sir. But in those 6 months, you've been to some interesting places in the Philippines already. I understand you've been to Marawi, of course, and you've been to Basilan. A lot of Filipinos have not even gone to Basilan.
Yeah, it's been a tremendous 6 months to be able to travel around and look at the areas where Australia is doing a lot of work and cooperating extensively with the Philippines government as we develop our development partnership, if you like. So going down to Marawi was special. I've done that twice because of what we were doing with you through the siege of Marawi back in 2017. But then the trip to Basilan was also quite extraordinary because that gave me the opportunity to meet a whole range of Abu Sayyaf surrenderees, 214 of them as a matter of fact, who had surrendered and come back into the fold. And that all forms part of a program that we've got with the Philippines government about pathways to peace, trying to promote stability and prosperity and security in the south of the country. So I loved that trip. That was really very, very interesting indeed.
Mr. Ambassador, you also came just in time for elections.
Yeah.
Tell us, first impressions. It's not that you're new to the Philippines.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've been a keen observer even from outside, but first impressions of the politics, of the environment, of everything.
So I was really interested by the midterm elections. So the embassy went out to have a look at the elections. So on election day, I got up very, very early and went out to the polling booths, and I was there as they opened. That was instructive just to see how the votes are actually cast, but also to see the Filipinos who are lining up to vote.
Which place was this that you visited?
So I visited 4 different locations around the outskirts of Manila. Yeah. And we also sent people up country.
Outside Manila?
Yeah, outside Manila as well, to have a look at how the voting transpired. And that was really, really interesting to see.
What was it like? I mean,
well, for us, very, very... But the way in which we vote is just different. So you've got a mechanised system, a computerised system. Ours is still filling in squares.
You're opening up a very sensitive topic.
Yeah, well, so anyway, all right, we won't go there, but nevertheless, I was intrigued by your system, and it looked really, really good. And for people to be able to cast their votes, how they fed their voting papers into the machine, and they got a receipt for their vote. And just the numbers, we've got a population of 25 million in Australia. You've got 108 million or thereabouts, and how many of those vote? That's an enormous number. So operating such an enormous system with that many people is really quite remarkable.
Still on impressions. Last time you were here, you were 38. It was 38 years ago.
21, 22.
Yeah, as you said, you're basically tourists passing through. What's changed? I mean, just again, still just on first impressions.
So the Philippines. So I went at that stage back in 1981. I went to Zamboanga. And I stayed there on New Year's Eve. Yeah, it was.
That was an interesting year.
It was a very interesting time, and Zamboanga was still a bit edgy back in 1981. And
we were still technically under martial law.
You were, and it was quite some experience to go into Zamboanga then, because the then president had constructed a major hotel. He was trying to boost the impression around the region and more broadly of the Philippines as a tourist destination. And no doubt my parents were enticed. So we went down there, stayed there New Year's Eve. We went to a cockfight, which was memorable.
New Year's Eve?
Yeah, so yeah, we did some interesting things. So we went to Zamboanga, we went to Cebu and Manila. Now when I go back to all of those places, the difference is phenomenal. Zamboanga's got a completely different feel. I've been there 3 times in the last 6 months. And last time I was there, I was able to spend some time with the mayor, Ben Clemenco, and that was terrific. I went through the middle of town, which I'd never done before in my visits to Zamboanga, and that was very promising. And just see the bustle and the sense of what it's like to be in that city. And that was really quite uplifting. Cebu, I can't even compare the difference between when I was there in 1981 and now. It's just a completely different place. And of course, Manila is virtually unrecognisable. There's a store that's my namesake. I remember that up this end of town, where my mother spent an enormous amount of time. But it's a very different city now.
I want to know more about your impressions on the elections, because it's the manifestation of democracy. We're both coming from democratic societies. I mean, did you feel the enthusiasm, and what were your impressions about our democracy?
On the day,
you've been here 6 months.
Yeah, on the day of the election, there was an enthusiasm. That's a good word to describe it, because as I went to the polling booths, just the queues of people who were there even before the polling booths opened, wanting to cast their vote.
Do you get that kind of enthusiasm in your country?
In Australia, voting's compulsory, so it's a bit more entertaining. But yes, people want to vote. People want to vote. But what I remember about your elections was that the people had come in, they'd obviously studied who they wanted to vote for, and they had little pieces of paper that they'd worked out
just to remember.
Yeah, not a how to vote card, which we might have in Australia, but pieces of paper, and they were sitting there and very, very methodically filling out the voting paper. I thought that was terrific.
Would you recommend mandatory voting? What's the pros and cons of mandatory voting?
Who am I to say? I think for Australia it is a good system. Because it does make people think. We actually fine members of the population who don't vote.
How much is the fine?
It's not that much, but nevertheless it's the principle. And I think it causes people to think about the country's future. And therefore that's a good thing. What do you want from your politicians? What do you want in terms of the policies of the future? How do you want the country to develop? How do you want it to prosper? In what's the nature of your political environment that you want to have? How do you want to relate to countries in the region and more broadly? So I think having compulsory voting in that sense is good for us. And we've always had it as long as I can remember.
And the downside, if any?
Well, I don't know that there is a downside. Some people do what we would call a donkey vote, so that they just fill in the form, and they just number the squares 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they spoil the ballot or put a line through it so their vote doesn't count. That to me is a pointless exercise, because you actually want to have a say in the future of your country. To me, it's very, very important to want to have that say and to try and chart the direction and try and work out what do you want, and pick the people who are going to deliver that for you.
I ask only because I think there's a very little stigma to it in the history of the Philippines. The last time compulsory voting, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, you would remember this better. But the last time I think this was really discussed was, again, still during the Marcos years, still in the context of martial law. And requiring people to vote, and therefore there is a generation that thought of it as ironically anti-democratic and undemocratic to force people to exercise their rights. But at the same time, when I was, as you know, Mr. Ambassador, I was in Australia recently on a tour with DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and it was something that to encounter it again. And then to encounter it in a very democratic society like Australia was very interesting. That's why I asked the question.
No, I think it's good for us, and it's served us well. And we've just been through our own election, which has returned the previous government back into office. So it's good to have that behind us, and now we chart the future for the next 3 years.